Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. The Federal Communications Commission voted in February to regulate internet access as a public utility in order to implement regulations assuring what has been labeled net neutrality. Most Americans use the internet in some fashion, and so this decision attracted significant media attention and obviously could affect all of us. Still, most of us are not very interested with the architecture of the internet, but the federal government has attempted to regulate many industries since the late 1800s. Joining me on EconVersations today to discuss Uncle Sam's record as an economic regulator is a very distinguished guest, Mr. Lawrence Reed. Larry serves as the president of the Foundation for Economic Education, or FEE, which for nearly 70 years has been working to educate people about how our market economy operates. Prior to joining FEE, Larry was a professor of economics at Northwood University and president of the Manuel Center for Public Policy, which is also located in Michigan. Welcome back to the show, Larry.
Thank you, Dan. Pleasure to be here.
So let's get started with this idea of regulating the internet and net neutrality. Tell us a little bit about what the FCC actually decided to do in February.
Okay. Quite on its own, without congressional approval, the Federal Communications Commission decided to impose what is called net neutrality, which basically means the fast lanes and the slow lanes on the internet now can't be differentiated in terms of pricing. Mm-hmm. They're basically saying everybody should be charged at the same rate, regardless of the speed that they want or the load that they put on the internet. It sounds good on the surface in that it sounds like, well, everybody's going to have access, nobody can be discriminated against and pay a higher rate. But the problem is every time government gets involved in something like this, it ignores the economics of the industry in its effort to be, quote, fair to everybody, and ends up empowering its own regulators and doing great harm to the industry. And what they want to do to the internet is essentially what they did to railroads over 100 years ago, which resulted ultimately in the bankruptcy of most of America's railroads.
And that's really sort of, I think, the bigger issue here, because they've decided to regulate internet access. And like the first regulation they're going to put forth on this regards net neutrality. But that doesn't mean it's the last or only regulation they're ever going to be able to do. They've really sort of changed the rules of the game for governing the internet.
It's the nose under the camel's tent. And it's really a kind of non-solution to a non-problem. I mean, the internet's been growing like crazy. When you think about the numbers of people who have access to ever better service today compared to 5-10 years ago, the market's been doing a marvelous job in extending access, making it more affordable. I think we should be alarmed at this federal intrusion, because regulating the internet can be seen and should be seen as also regulating speech. Mm-hmm. It's only a matter of time when they go from regulating pricing to regulating content. And that's an area that I think all of us should be very alarmed about, to have the federal government in the business of regulating content, or the price of that content.
Mm-hmm. And although this is a new venture for the FCC to attempt to regulate the internet access, the federal government and the FCC itself has a pretty long track record of attempting to regulate entire industries or entire aspects of our economy. And that's what we more want to talk about here today, this what the track record shows. And I think that track record's not all that good, is it?
No, it isn't. And it typically follows a pattern where you have an outcry from some quarters of the public, even if it's a small minority. The politicians pick up on it, demagogue it, and say, I'm going to ride in on the white horse and save you through regulation. And then they set up the regulation, and the so-called reformers then move on to the next cause, while the regulatory bureaucracy is grown and often captured by the very people that it's supposed to regulate.
Mm-hmm. And so that ends up being an issue here, that regulation, I think, as we'll see and as we go through some of the examples, has often been used to benefit certain businesses at the expense of either their competitors or sometimes their customers, right?
That's right. And the regulations quite often do damage to the unseen, to the would-be entrepreneurs, to the newcomers, to the ones who might have started a competing business out of their garage to compete with the big guys, but now, because of the regulations that seem to advantage the already existing politically well-connected big guys, the little guy never gets a start. And that has happened time and again in the history of federal regulations.
Because if nothing else, just to attempt to deal with the regulatory bureaucracy requires lawyers or requires a lot of effort.
The big companies that have the vast legal departments, and it's their advice that's typically sought by the bureaucracy for the writing of new regulations. And they're not above suggesting rules that might disadvantage their existing competitors or newcomers that could appear in a free market.
Well, let's take a look at some of the examples of industries that the federal government has attempted to regulate. The first one you talked about in a recent article in responding or in reaction to the FCC decision is trucking.
Yes.
And trucking was regulated, I guess, for a long time under the Interstate Commerce Commission, right?
That's right.
And how did that work out for consumers?
It was a disaster. It's such a disaster that, in fact, it was a Democratic president, Jimmy Carter, who initiated the deregulation of trucking. But for years, in an effort to, I'm not sure what they said they were doing, but in an effort to regulate the trucking industry, they benefited the existing trucking firms and disadvantaged newcomers who might challenge it. And in the long run, they even did harm to the very companies they were regulating. It was a common practice during the heyday of trucking regulation for trucks to be hauling stuff maybe across the country, a full load, but then having to come all the way back with nothing because they couldn't get the permit from the regulatory authorities to come back with another load, which doubled the cost of hauling the stuff in the first place. So deregulation finally allowed for much greater efficiencies. When we got rid of that stuff, it was natural for a trucking company to say, I'm not going to run my truck halfway across the country with nothing on it.
Right.
That raises the cost of everything. So now that inefficiency is pretty much gone.
So yeah, companies now advertise that they're trying to minimize that.
Yeah.
This idea of empty backhauls, that you don't want, you've taken your load one place and now what do you do with your truck? And you don't want to have to drive it back or drive it back across the country empty.
Yeah, those empty hauls were mandated by federal regulations, which ended up raising the cost of consumer goods and trucking to all of us.
And it was raising those costs and not really benefiting anybody. Nobody was really benefiting. The trucking companies weren't really benefiting from the extra costs of the empty backhauls, right?
That's right. And now the trucking unions were generally in support of it because they thought we're spreading the work out. But of course, by raising the cost of transportation, they were just reducing the demand for trucking and the demand for jobs in trucking. They were hurting their own, or spiting their, or what's the phrase? Hurting themselves to spite their nose. I got that wrong, but you got the message.
Right. And so we did manage to actually, under Jimmy Carter, eliminate trucking regulation back in the late 1970s. It turns us to another industry that we regulated. I think it was actually regulated before we regulated trucking, and it was the railroad industry, which it was actually the industry that the ICC was created to help regulate back in 1887. So tell us a little bit about how regulation turned out for the railroads.
Okay. I think it's important to know first that railroad regulation was stimulated by some real abuses. But those abuses themselves were the result almost always of previous federal interventions. We got the government in the business in the 1850s of subsidizing railroads. And the three big transcontinentals that everybody reads so much about were heavily subsidized by the government. And people were throwing down track to get the federal subsidies, not because laying down the track made economic sense otherwise. And they all went bankrupt, and lots of people were hurt by that. And so the argument was, well, now we have to regulate because the evil railroads are doing nasty things to people. Well, yeah, you do nasty things to people if you're being paid by the government to do it. It skews the incentive system, so you end up being paid to do nasty things. But then when we set up the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate them, we went down the path of the federal government fixing rates that could be charged for hauling. And one of the first things they did was to implement the long and short haul clause for price regulation. And what that famously did was, it said to the railroads, you cannot charge more per mile to a customer who just has a little bit to haul a short distance. You can't charge him more per mile than you charge somebody who brings you a lot of business and wants to haul a great distance. So that meant that somebody with a lot of traffic, a lot of volume, who could have bargained with the railroads to get a lower per mile rate, all of a sudden they're told, sorry, you can't get a break. The effect of it was to raise the costs of rail transportation for everybody. It gave a huge stimulus to the alternative means of transportation, like trucks and so forth. Just think of the differences. If you're hauling things by car or truck, you get subsidized roads. Well, now with regulation of railroads, the government stops building rails and subsidizing it, but now they fix your price. And so we disadvantaged railroads over time and drove many of them into bankruptcy and federal takeover, precisely because we did the kind of rate intervention that they're now talking about doing to the internet in regulating fast lanes versus slow lanes.
And again, it didn't end up benefiting consumers. It ultimately hurt even the railroads, right?
Absolutely, and drove many of them into bankruptcy. So if you had your pension funds invested in a railroad that went bankrupt, you probably got hurt. So no, railroad regulation was a disaster for this country, and that's recognized now by the great preponderance of economists.
And economists had actually done a lot of the research that really helped show a lot of this, that it truly was not helping consumers and adding lots of costs. Well, in the 1930s, we started to see the airline industry emerge, and this was an industry that got regulated almost from the get-go by the federal government under a group called the Civil Aeronautics Board. And how did airline regulation work out for our nation?
Another disaster that ultimately had to be undone through deregulation when that disaster was recognized. The Civil Aeronautics Board was fixing routes and fares for airlines. And I recall back in that day, before deregulation, the big example that those of us who favored free markets in air transportation would cite was Southwest Airlines. Because it flew within Texas, its rates were not regulated, okay? Only if you flew across state lines would you come under CAB regulations. So it was apparent that here's an airline flying pretty good distances and charging a fraction of what other airlines are charging per mile or for comparable distances. And Southwest is making money, but the other ones were not, quite typically. So we argued successfully that, hey, subject all the airlines to the kind of free market competition that Southwest experiences within Texas, and you'll have lower rates and fuller planes, lower costs, more efficient service. Finally, that was recognized and we got rid of that all. But for decades, in the name of protecting the consumer, we were simply jacking up plane fares so that plane travel was pretty much a luxury for the rich, not for the average guy.
Now, one of my favorite examples of I think what we can now say was waste during the airline regulation were these examples of like piano bars on the 747s that the airlines flew on their domestic routes, which completely went away with deregulation. But this shows an important element of why, one of the reasons why regulation doesn't work, right? Because I mean, the airlines were still sort of competing. They couldn't cut their prices, but they could do other things, right?
That's right. They couldn't compete in fares or in routes without CAB approval. So they competed in terms of the nicest looking stewardesses, as we called them back then, or the piano bars, or other things that really catered to a small clientele, which was the very wealthy. Deregulation opened up plane travel to the average American by reducing costs and making the airlines more competitive.
Well, when I cover this in class, I sometimes like to point students back to that, National Lampoon's Vacation, and when Chevy Chase piles the family into the station wagon to drive across the country, and I say well, that's what we used to do because you couldn't fly across the country. You certainly couldn't afford to fly for your family's summer vacation. You had to pile in the station wagon and drive, right?
And that was not as safe either as plane travel, even back then. The risks of an incident on the highway endangering your life have always been greater than incidents by air travel. So by forcing the fares up on planes and people then into more dangerous cars for travel, we were actually contributing to more deaths through accidents in the country than would have been the case if we'd had free markets.
And consumers certainly voted with their pocketbooks in the aftermath of deregulation, because we saw all of these extra perks or all this extra quality be cut by the airlines, right?
That's right. And I remember in the early years of that, when planes all of a sudden started filling up and ordinary people were flying who couldn't afford it before, some of the snooty folks who had been catered to by the airlines before kind of looked down their noses. Who are these riffraff joining me on the plane now? Well, the fact is they were ordinary people who could finally afford to travel by plane because deregulation brought the price down.
And one of the great things that happens when we had deregulation, the CAB actually closed down, right?
That's right. It was one of the few federal agencies that did not have eternal life.
One that actually closed down. In addition to regulating industries, governments have also attempted to regulate elements of quality or safety of our products. And one of the first examples of this went back to the Meat Inspection Act in 1906. And that was passed in part because of the uproar caused by Upton Sinclair's, like it's a novel, The Jungle. But tell us a little bit about the origins of meat inspection.
Okay. Upton Sinclair, who was by his own admission a socialist eager to advance that political cause, wrote The Jungle intending to make a case for bigger government in a lot of areas, but he was surprised at the impact, because he didn't think that his focus was not on poor conditions in the meat packing plants. That was a few pages in the book, and it was largely untrue. He pretty much cooked it up. He hardly spent any time there. He writes in The Jungle about workers being falling into vats and being ground up into Durham's pure leaf lard. So many generations of Americans read that and thought, "Oh, isn't that awful? We have to regulate that?" The fact is, that never happened to anybody. I mean, why doesn't anybody ever ask, what happened to Joe? He used to work here, now he's gone. People who worked in the plants worked with fellow workers. They had families, they had friends. Nobody ever claimed that, hey, Joe got ground up into my meat. That was just pure fiction. But it led to a federal movement to impose meat inspection at the federal level, which had already existed, by the way, but it led to a strengthening of it. But the biggest change was it put the taxpayers on the hook for the cost of it. And that's why the meat packers ultimately supported the regulation, because they saw it as a way to put the federal stamp of approval on their product and to get the taxpayers to pick up the tab for it.
Well, I think that'll be an interesting point to keep in mind here as we go further, that sometimes the companies that are being regulated are going to figure out ways to benefit. Now, you'd also mentioned that it's possible that the government meat inspection had actually helped contribute to the spread of disease.
Yes, there's an interesting article by Jeffrey Tucker on our website, fee.org. If you type in meat inspection Tucker, I'm sure you'll find it, where he cites some very convincing sources that indicate that the very presence of meat inspectors and traveling from some of the less sanitary portions of the, like the byproducts of meat preparation, and then going to another plant actually carried with it some disease elements, and that may have exacerbated what was previously a minimal problem, but made it much worse.
So even just on the very narrow thing of trying to inspect the meat to make sure it's safe for consumption, the federal government wasn't doing a very good job of simply that task.
That's right. And this is not necessarily an argument against all regulation,
right,
but it just says we should stop this fanciful thinking of, all we have to do is have politicians write up new rules and create a bureaucracy and all will be well. There are lots of downsides to that, oftentimes greater than the upside.
And let's see, we also have adopted a federal regulation for pharmaceuticals, both the medical devices and pharmaceuticals that we use, and the Food and Drug Administration regulates these.
Yes.
So how has FDA regulation of our medicines worked out for us?
Well, I know that there's a kind of a religious faith in the FDA. Oh, they're protecting us from bad pharmaceuticals. But the fact is, when you create something like that, there are inherent incentives within the system to a kind of a bias against the introduction of new life-saving drugs. Because from the standpoint of an FDA regulator, if they say yes to something that proves to be a bad drug, they're going to, that's going to put the agency in a bad light. So they're inclined to say no and to drag it out. So now it costs a fortune and about 14 years for a company to finally get FDA approval. That's why drugs in the United States often come on the market here long after they've already been introduced and doing beneficial things in places like Europe, which doesn't have quite as stringent a regulatory apparatus. So the FDA, on balance, quite likely has resulted in more people dying because of lack of access to new drugs than people saved by their preventing an occasional bad drug from coming on the market.
To say nothing of the effects of the regulation on the drug prices themselves, which
That's right.
Clearly then makes prescription drug coverage so much more important because the price of drugs are so much higher than, say, in Mexico or Canada or where other places you can buy them as well.
That's right. They've raised the cost, increased the paperwork, added to liability risks, and stifled competition. All of that produces higher prices.
But some people, I'm sure, would be saying, like, well, back before we had the FDA, we had people selling stuff like snake oil and then making all these claims about their medicine would cure every ailment known to man. And we know the products either did nothing or sometimes they were laced with actual serious hard drugs that well surely would help put your child to sleep, but you're giving them some nasty drugs. They'll put them to sleep, but you're drugging them. So, I mean, don't we need something like the FDA to protect us from the snake oil salesmen out there?
Well, don't forget, there are plenty of snake oil salesmen in government. They're called politicians, and often the regulators themselves are selling stuff that of dubious value. So it isn't a problem unique to the private sector. You're no doubt correct that there always have been such charlatans out there. And any time in ordinary law you have an occasion where somebody falsifies a product, makes a promise, doesn't deliver, deceives, or does real harm to an unsuspecting customer, absolutely the law should provide a remedy for that. I don't know that the remedy has to be a federally appointed body of regulators. Ordinary law would tend to take care of that. You provide redress of grievances through the evidence process and a court process as a matter of basic government function.
So you could bring a tort claim against a manufacturer, or I guess a breach of contract claim against a manufacturer who put a product out on the market that wasn't safe.
Absolutely, and the idea that America was ever beset with millions of these snake oil salesmen deceiving millions of people, these were occasional charlatans that in almost every case were taken care of rather quickly when people in the market realized the stuff isn't working. And the market, in most cases, solved the problem long before the politicians ever caught notice.
Well, the FCC has its own history of regulation, and they've regulated our broadcast media, both initially radio and then television, for decades, essentially, because actually the Internet regulation is under the 1934 Communications Act. So the FCC's had a role in regulating itself. And again, how's the FCC done with television?
Rather poorly. The FCC was the main reason why for so many decades we had only 3 major channels plus UHF because we were stifling competition from newcomers. We also had for many years the fairness doctrine that, at least in radio, had the effect of stifling new voices because radio stations had to be concerned, if we have this person on and he says something, we're going to be obligated to provide equal time to this other guy. And so they were always under the watchful eye of regulators as to content. Well, the moment we got rid of the fairness doctrine, what happens? Something we now call talk radio, a blossoming of a diversity of opinions. Now, some say, well, but it's dominated by conservatives. Well, that's not because of anything other than they seem to do better at radio than liberals. But there's nothing that prevents liberals from competing. But there used to be that there was. The fairness doctrine would stifle all controversial opinion out of fear that if we put this guy on, we got to have that guy, or run afoul of the regulations.
So by actually saying, like, if you took if you gave a person with an opinion 1 hour, you might have to then give another hour to somebody with a counter opinion.
That's right.
And that'd be another hour of programming that may or may not draw a lot of viewers.
Can you imagine doing that to book publishing? If we said every publisher, you got to be fair. If you publish this book, you got to publish that one. Well, there would be a tendency not to publish much of anything. But we never had that with books. So what do we have? We have book houses, publishing houses that publish a broad range of perspectives. There's no shortage of viewpoints expressed in the book market. And fortunately, since we got rid of regulation, there's no stifling of diversity in the radio market.
You'd also mentioned that if we'd had access or regulation of the internet in place, I mean, there are a lot of potential companies that have been harmed by all this creative destruction that we've seen with the internet that might have been able to use regulation to try to stifle what was emerging with the internet. And so you gave a couple of examples.
Oh, that's right.
How could this have worked out differently?
Well, if you had, some of the industries or businesses in the industry, in cable and so forth, are behind the scenes backing some of this regulation because they think they're politically well connected, whether it be Netflix, Google, or whatever. The regulatory regime might bias the market in their favor. And they know the politicians, so they can always push things in their direction. That's the inherent danger of this stuff. The politically well connected and powerful use the regulations and their friends in government to crush newcomers. The newcomer doesn't have those kinds of connections or money, but they're the ones that end up getting crushed.
So like Encyclopedia Britannica, they've certainly, I don't know if anyone buys encyclopedias anymore because we have this thing called Wikipedia, but that's emerged with the internet, right? That was certainly one company that had a well-established business, and it's been totally disrupted.
That's right.
They might have been able to appeal to regulation to save their business model, right?
And they might well have done it because that's happened time and again. Existing businesses aren't necessarily in favor of competition when they know that it puts a gun at their head. A lot of companies would much prefer to have a non-competitive market and use the regulations to assure that.
And this really, I think maybe the most frightening aspect of the regulation going forward is just the opening of the door to all of this, as you mentioned, the behind the scenes crony capitalism of, I don't know if net neutrality is really going to end up benefiting Netflix or if it's going to end up benefiting Comcast. It's hard to know from you or I as consumers, but we certainly know if all they have to do now is convince the FCC that they have a good idea, and we could end up being stuck with it, right?
That's right, and it would be amazing if that didn't happen, because it's happened in every other area of regulation. The use of the rules of government to advantage oneself, and if that means buying a politician to get it done, there'll be plenty of people who are eager to do it.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, Larry. Enjoy this talk. And thank you for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.